Hey there, I'm Bill Roman. Welcome back to Guy Shrink. We've been on a little sabbatical for a little while.
It's been a little while.
Yeah, it's been a while. We're back in shape, and this is our first episode for a new season. And we brought back a very good friend and someone we've talked with before, Tim Lusch, Cleveland, Ohio. So we're recording in Toledo, Ohio, Glass City. And our engineer, Jordan Valdiviez at Cogito Studios, he's in an airport right now in Kansas City, somewhere between Kansas City on his way back to L.A. So it's kind of crazy here. Tim's in Cleveland, I'm in Toledo, and Jordan is going to be in the air here soon on our way back home to L.A. So, Tim, it's great to see you again, as always. And as we've talked before, but what keeps you awake at night?
Well, other than the guy with a motorcycle across the street who loves to rev it, I would only say that, the question of am I fully alive? Am I living fully alive? I think there's been a lot of stuff on spending too much time on your phones lately, and Lord knows I do for work and for play. And I think what I tend to think about at the end of the day when I'm settling in is, did I live today, or was I phoning it in, playing with my phone and not engaging? And I think about that a lot more now because the temptation is even greater.
So that's enough to keep you awake at night, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, you and I have talked before about, what do we want to do in our first episode of our new season? And you and I talked about why a guy should do philosophy or at least think philosophically. Everybody does. We may not call it that, but everybody's got some kind of idea about how life works. And we've talked about Jim Stockdale, and the longest held prisoner in Vietnam is spent about 8 years at the Hanoi Hilton with John McCain.
Yeah.
And he's written quite a bit of reflective philosophy. And when he got shot down over Vietnam, he said, as he's bailing out, as his parachute's opening and he's heading onto hostile territory, he says, I am now leaving the world I know and entering the world of Epictetus, the great philosopher of Stoicism in Greece. And you and I talked about how much we're attracted to that philosophy, Stoic philosophy. But I'd just like to begin our conversation today with a quote from Stockdale that you and I have talked about quite a bit. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to read it and then launch off and see what happens. He writes, every good leader is a good teacher. He's able to give those around him a sense of perspective and to set the moral, social, and particularly the motivational climate among his followers. This is not an easy task. It takes wisdom and self-discipline. It requires the sensitivity to perceive philosophic disarray in one's charges and knowledge of how to put things in order. So what do you make about philosophic disarray?
Well, if you're not in disarray when you're parachuting into, hostile territory, and I think the thought that he had was 5 years. He just immediately, he knew what he was getting into, and he just said, okay, 5 years. The strength of a person that can mentally prepare for what's coming by saying, all right, 5 years a prisoner. He obviously had done plenty of philosophical work before that day. And I think that preparation is key. But I think for me, in my experience, the philosophic disarray, it's a great phrase, happened early in my life. I think I was around 21, and, the life that I knew had just, exploded. My father disclosed to us that he had had an affair, 20-year affair, pretty much most of my whole life. And, it was, apart from the damage it did and the hurt it caused and, everything else, practically for me, and I remember this very, very sharply, is that, the question that came to my mind is, well, who is this man and who am I? Because so much of my life had been based on, my relationship with my father, who he was, I was his son. What does that mean? And, it was tormenting because, I didn't have the answers and I didn't have the tools to get those answers. And I found those ultimately, through prayer and philosophy. And that's when I started doing philosophy because, I guess existentially, the word, has some value here, but existentially, I was questioning everything about myself, about my life, and so how to live. Before I even knew it was a sort of a Socratic interest, I knew for myself I didn't know how to live. I didn't know what to do, and so out of that disarray, I began clawing out and trying to do philosophy, I guess you'd say.
Okay, well, Tim, when you talk about existential, I mean, we use that word a lot. How do you understand existential crisis? How do you understand the word existential, which a lot of us don't know about?
I think it's for me. I mean, there's I think some argument over the technical definition in philosophy and that sort of thing. Existentialism, as Camus and others understood it, but for me, I think, when I think of essence or essential, the inside of someone's spirituality, someone's inner thoughts that maybe the world doesn't see or doesn't know or doesn't ever hear, those things go to the essence of a person. They're the things that we know about ourselves that we don't really hide from other people or that we don't disclose to other people. I think of existentialism as our attitude or disposition towards the world. How are we situated in the world, and not necessarily what others see of us or what they think of us or all that, but just what is our attitude, our disposition toward the world around us, and what do we bring, with ourselves? Who are we? What substance is in there that we put out into the world, and what for good or bad, And I think we're all doing philosophy. I think some just are doing bad philosophy, but I think that's what, for me, when I talk about an existential crisis, it's a buzzword in, a lot of therapeutic conversations. But, for me, I think it just means that the very core of who I was in the world, as I understood it, was shaken. And I had to come to a new understanding.
Okay. So you think existentialism, aside from the more technical thing in philosophy, is really about discovering what's up with me and being responsible for me. It's really gaining self-responsibility in one's life. That's really the essence of existentialism. The Christian philosopher Dallas Willard made an observation one time where he talks about certain disciplines that one could engage in if one wants to actually do deep diving. And he talked about solitude and silence being probably the two most important things in this day and age in which we now live. Solitude and silence. And he talked about what that meant. And then somebody raised their hand and said, well, why would I want to do that? and his response, without missing a beat, said, to see if there's anything to you.
Yeah.
And it's like, ooh, that's a toughie there, to see if there's anything to you. So existential crisis is really, is there anything to you? Is there anything really about you?
And I remember you saying that to me. I remember going on a silent retreat down in Kentucky and, no talking of any kind and to anyone. And I didn't have a phone in those days, cell phone. So it was really, and I remember that visceral feeling of like, anxiety about, what am I going to do now? I'm all by myself. And that whole, I remember you saying that, see what you're made of. And I thought, well, maybe I'm not made of what I thought I was, and this was years after reading and studying and being, more introspective about things. And so it's tough. And I think the existential crisis for a lot of people, it does have that same function, maybe not in the same way solitude works on you or silence works on you, but, within a person, it has that same function.
Certainly. And a crisis could be anything, really. It could be terribly traumatic or it could be, irritating. But in fact, irritations are probably the best examples of what's really about you. Just ride in traffic for 15 minutes. Uh-huh. I noticed recently that our local Costco has put speed bumps in the parking lot. Now, what does that say? Put speed bumps in the parking lot. And that means that people are irritating and they're driving. Where did you go on all that? In an existential crisis, you do some introspection. If you want to say, I did a review of me and to see if there's anything to me. And I discovered maybe there were some things found wanting. What did you do to make up for the things that were found wanting?
Well, I think I think just out of survival, I started looking elsewhere. I looked at men specifically because, I am a man, and how they were living. How did they live? And I knew what had disappointed me in my father, and I knew I didn't want to do that. So I started with what I didn't want to be didn't want to become and didn't want to know. And of course I had, I went to Catholic school, so they learned the 10 Commandments. I mean, I had the basic, moral guidance, but for me, it was a practical day to day. I started looking at other men and how they lived. And I started, sticking with the winners, as we say, where I looked at the ones that were living successfully and how they were doing it. And then I became a sponge. I've told you this before. I started sort of glomming on to those men who were living, good lives, successful lives, men whom I admired for different reasons. And I started sponging off of them. And I'd either ask them questions, or just followed what they were doing. And, and then it snowballed. It really did. I really can't take credit for a lot of the decisions, the good decisions that came after, because so much of that was the product of mentorship, yourself included, but other, professors and
Sure.
people, men I worked with. And even if they weren't really a mentor in a formal way, I learned from them. I really became a learner and a sponge. And I just decided that this, would be what I'd have to do to find a way,
Yes.
It's mine. And I got my phone, do not disturb. So, okay. Hang on. Oh yeah. Oh, there we are. I'm sorry. Damn it.
Well, we have Jordan's superior veneering.
I don't know, but I hate those dang things. But anyway, it's all right. No, I got it. You're good.
Yeah, I was just going to good. Thanks, Jordan. So, Tim, you were talking about being a sponge. I love that as a quote from a guy named Hugh Kerr, I believe. And he said something about all wisdom is plagiarism, only stupidity is original. So it's important to be a sponge. Philosophy is about being a sponge. I mean, here's Stockwell parachuting down to hostile Vietnam and saying, I'm entering the world of Epictetus, which is, 300 BC or so. And he was a sponge. He'd already took care of some things, and how important that is,
Yeah, and especially, he was going into an environment that was devoid of many kinds of external stimulus other than torture. I mean, he wasn't going to be around family, friends, work colleagues. I mean, all the other things that he knew.
Yeah.
And talk about being stripped bare.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So somebody like that is if I had run into Stockdale when I was 21, I think I would have read everything that he wrote, and probably twice, because you pick up right away. I know I have in reading them, some of the selections that you suggested, because right away when you're reading them, this is the real deal.
Sure.
This is a man with a very, very strong sense of his own self.
Yes. Yeah, which is a part of what philosophy does. It helps one be able to define, you're able to define yourself in a situation. And so you're able to make a stand. And that's different than, standing up with a gun. It's about making a stand, a philosophical stand about, I believe this, think this, I'm not going to do that. And you got some kind of philosophic underpinning to be able to pull that off.
Yeah. And right. Because it's, a lot of people live, and I know I did for a number of years when I was younger, by negation. You might say, well, I'm not like that. I'm not like those people. I don't do that. But you're not really defining who you are. You're looking at it from a negative perspective, which is useful to a point, but it's only a starting point. The affirmative questions of who am I are much more difficult and require much more effort to determine who I am versus who I'm not.
Sure. Back when you and I began talking about this episode, way back in July, was when we really kind of started some initial conversations about this. And what had happened right about that time was Michael Klein, who had founded Fandango, gazillionaire, successful by every stretch of the imagination, suddenly fell from the balcony of a hotel 20 stories in New York, and was ruled a suicide. And now I'm not making any moral judgments about that, but here was a guy that had it all. What happened, and let's conjecture just for a minute, not in a judgmental way. What do you think happened to Mr. Klein?
It's hard to say. I think that's always the question with suicides, but you just got the sense from at least what I read about that. And I remember, you see a lot in the news and you kind of pass over it, but that really clicked with me because it wasn't just that he had everything in terms of external things and resources and money and that, but he had obviously done what he set out to do in his life. He was an entrepreneur and a creative, inventor and all that. And, at the end of it, all of that, everything that he had and everything he had done wasn't enough to keep him here. And setting aside any kind of, severe mental illness or maladies or things like that.
Sure.
Just, it's always been the question with people who, are confronted with that. And we all are. I mean, whether to keep living today or quit, and I think it seemed to me that there just wasn't there wasn't any water in that well that he was drawing from. It might have been a deep well, but it was dry. And because I think everything that I read about that, there really wasn't a precipitating event or diagnoses or anything like that. And it just seemed that, his bucket was coming up empty and he'd had enough of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think those are stories that are worth remembering, not in a judgmental way or moral way, but what's preventing me from doing that, going in that direction, and what's in my bucket, so to speak.
Yeah.
And we've talked a lot about stoicism and philosophical underpinnings. What do you think are some of the ones that work for you? A couple of ideas, maybe from stoicism, that work for you as a kind of a grounding for who you are. Because as you said, and I do believe this is true, every man is a philosopher. Every man has some philosophy of life, some way to navigate life. What might be some of those ideas for you?
Well, I think of, I think for me, it's really become front and center in navigating life, especially as I've gotten older. But I came to, still in my 20s, when I read Marcus Aurelius, and his meditations, who was taught by Epictetus, as many know. I think the sort of self-examination that he did, on a regular basis, and the philosophical challenges that he challenged himself with. Why are you concerned with what this person said about you? Don't you, the universe is passing away and you're worried about this sort of thing. And, and I think that kind of self-examination and not to the point of being consumed with a paralysis of analysis, as they say, but just that, beyond an examination for like confession, which I was used to, this was different because I was asking myself, from a philosophical standpoint, why are you concerned with these passing things that are in front of you and not what's deeper or more important? And so then it made me think of, well, what is more important? I think that, and then I think the way that Aurelius especially carried himself around the personalities and politics of ancient Rome. He was in a cesspool of bad humanity, and he's the emperor, and he's out there in a tent, philosophizing, and I think the way that he was able to confront a lot of these tempestuous situations and personalities in a sort of, back off kind of way and a little more relaxed sort of way is counter to my nature, which is to go busting right in there. I want to make heads roll. And
Right.
I didn't know how not to be that way. My father was that way, and I'm like a wrecking ball. And so for me, Aurelius is, calmer approach, a more considered approach.
Sure.
Let's wait and see. We don't know all these things.
Okay. Okay.
That helped a lot.
Okay, that's good. Good. Yeah, Cicero called that the dregs of Romulus. When he was talking about Cato,
Yes.
It's out of place because he doesn't realize he's in the dregs of Romulus.
Yeah.
Cato wants to stand above all this fray as opposed to, hey, you're in the middle of it, kind of thing. But you talk about Marcus Aurelius, the great Roman emperor, was the most powerful man in the world at that time.
Wow.
I'm thinking about the more practical applications of philosophy that he had. He begins book 5 with the idea that the alarm clock's going off. Oh, crap. It's really warm and cozy in this bed. I think I just want to stay here in the covers. That his existential crisis was getting up in the morning.
Yeah.
And then he says, and then I thought, what was I made for? I was made to get up and do work. to get busy as opposed to laying in these warm covers. I had to laugh about that. Isn't that the crisis we all have in the morning? Oh crap! The alarm's going off. It's really cozy in this bed.
Yeah. And and it's true, because I think that's ultimately that the practicality of that, because we all have little existential crises and big ones and whatever, but I think on a daily basis, I think that's the first question. And, Teddy Roosevelt was famous for that, yelling at himself to get action, get up and get action. And I think that's it. We're all confronted with that choice, in the morning when we're tired, we can kind of slumber through the day and bop around, or we can get up and be intentional and get some stuff done and help some people. And
well, Tim, do you have a morning routine? Is there something you kind of do every morning? Marcus Aurelius certainly did. When the alarm goes off, what do you do? Is there something that you kind of do that kind of gets the day going for you?
Well, I set up my coffee rig the night before.
That's good. That's good.
So I'm ready. Some men don't need coffee in the morning, and that's great, but I do. And so I turn the hot water on, and I spend some time in prayer and some reading, and then I go to the gym. And that's pretty much every day. There's some exceptions, traveling and whatnot, but for the most part, that's what I do, because it allows me physically and spiritually to confront what comes at me from a clear, mind, and a body that's a little warmed up, because it's starting to ache more now when I get out of bed.
Yeah, sure. It's age coming. It's I work with a lot of guys in my professional life, and we talk a lot about morning routines, because I think morning routines are really good, and it's a kind of a philosophical standard when we do something like that. And I often coach guys, let's put it that way, jump out of bed and make the bed right away, unless your partner is still asleep, or the dogs don't want to move,
right,
and make the bed, and then say this: I have never lived today before.
Yes,
I picked that up from a good friend many years ago. I've never, what an interesting, as opposed to, oh crap, another day.
Yeah,
I've never lived this day before. And then the practice of some intentional breathing, or yoga or something like that, and then 50 push-ups. I'm a big fan of doing something like that, and then write something down that you're grateful for. Just kind of get going. You can do this. You can do all of this in about 4 minutes, really. But it sets the standard for different than going, oh crap, you thought for a minute it's cozy in the bed, but I wasn't made for the bed. I need to get going. So
I like that. I like that a lot. And I do make the bed as well. It usually early, but it's not the first thing I do. But I do have smaller disciplines like that for that reason, just because I think that just trains you for those mornings you don't want to get up. The momentum of discipline and habit is what, pulls you up. Because motivation isn't coming for me on a lot of mornings. It's just not. And I'm not waiting for it, because it's not coming.
No, motivation doesn't show up. It really,
Once in a while it knocks. There's a faint knock at the door, and I like, oh, okay. But otherwise I have to, but I think that's right. That not living before, that's a totally, and I think that's part of the existential, definition is that attitude or disposition of facing the world. We can face the world like, it's time to make the donuts. Here we go. That kind of day. Or we can say, I've never lived, this day before, and look at the possibility and the freshness that comes with that. And that's exhilarating.
I believe that's true. I absolutely believe that's true. So what are some of the, you mentioned reading as one of your disciplines, doing some reading. What are some things that you've read that's been helpful to ground yourself philosophically, if you want to call that, or give you a roadmap or some signs about how to function differently? What are some things that you found helpful over the the years that you've been doing that?
I think we talked about this a little bit a few times before, but you can read philosophy in the Socratic dialogues and Descartes and Camus and everyone else, and that's all fine and well. But in terms of doing philosophy in your own life, which is essentially right what it really is, it doesn't exist in the ivory tower, except for a few academics. For the rest of us, it's out here. We're doing philosophy. They might be talking about it, but we're doing it. And for me, reading about it in literature, in narrative, was probably the best and most, effective path. And I think for me, early on, I spent a lot of time with the Book of Sirach, which is one of the wisdom books in Catholic Bible, full of pithy sayings,
Okay.
And I just was soaking it up because it was, I could read that for 10 minutes and I would have a real lot to work with, but books that were more philosophical, I would say, I think, Robert Bolt's play, A Man for All Seasons, was foundational for me because Moore had what Bolt said was an adamantine sense of his own self. He knew who he was. And so he could face the threat from Henry VIII, clearly and fully as a man because he knew who he was and what he was about.
Well, the problem with the guy that wants to define himself like Sir Thomas More is you got to make people mad.
Well,
you may lose your head literally about that.
Yeah. Yeah. There are risks as opposed to, Richard Rich, who just did whatever the king wanted. But, you can also lose your head that way, too. And so, but I think the other book, too, is Walker Percy's The Moviegoer. And it's not like a riveting whodunit, so any man that reads it, it's a slower read. But the questions that he asks in there and sort of the lead character's approach to living were what grabbed me. And it was the guy's name was Binks Bowling, I think. And he reiterated over and over that the search was the thing. He was on the search. And, it's as you go through the book, you're getting a sense of what that means for him. But, I realized that for me, that made a lot of sense because life is really a search. It doesn't end at any artificial plateau that I create career-wise or academic or whatever. And so that was a sort of a guiding framework that I had, was the search.
Okay.
So I'd say those three.
Okay. Yeah. I as you're saying search, that brings to my mind that one of my models of life is sailing in a boat, the sailboat, which I've had before. Years ago we had a sailboat, and so many people think that sailing is just, you just go in a straight line over there from Put in Bay to Catawba. You don't do that. You're constantly going right, then coming about and going left, and then you come about and go right, and it's called course correction.
Yeah,
you're moving forward, but a little at a time. But you're constantly correcting your course. And I think if we have that kind of an idea of life, that philosophical idea that it's about course correction. I'm going too far this way. What can I do to move back over here towards the center line at moving forward the whole time?
Yeah. And I think that, and I'm not being a sailor myself, but I think that reminds me of what I think it was Flannery O'Connor that said that God writes straight in crooked lines. And
there's, Flannery O'Connor, right.
The idea of sort of zooming out, like we get too much in our own heads and in our own little spaces. And, when you zoom out at your life, I'm sure now, as you get older, you look back and you realize that as jagged as things might have been, the line between A and B was actually much straighter the more distance you get from it. And, makes you more forgivable of yourself and other people when you realize that too, because, you're less likely to get all bent out of shape about one crooked turn.
Sure. And of course, as you're talking about that, I'm thinking immediately the difference between holding your phone with Google Maps and holding a Rand McNally atlas.
Yeah.
And the maps, the Google Maps just shows you in the instant that you're at, pretty much. But you get the lay of the land with an atlas. You see it where all that stuff is at, and that's a more philosophical idea about the entire lay of the land, how important that is. Yeah.
And actually, and that too, I think the physicality of a map, of a book, that keeps us, keeps our feet planted on the ground, right? I mean, it's easy when you get online with social media and everything else to have an existence out in the ether. Well, that doesn't really exist. It's all artificial. It's nothing, So, I mean, the idea of holding a map to find out where you're going, whether it's a metaphor for, doing philosophy or just trying to find out where you're going, there is something to that because it's rooting us to where and what we really are, which are human beings.
Yeah. Which is one of the reasons why I like Flannery O'Connor so much. She has all these stories about all these weird people, which are about real people,
Yeah. Yeah. The freaks. Yeah. She calls them the freaks.
Yeah, yeah, right. Her stories are just loaded with all that kind of
Well,
stuff.
and the thing I love about her as well is that I identify with the freaks throughout. I typically, there isn't one in there that I'm not seeing something I said or did that resembles that character.
So, what are some other thoughts about a guy doing philosophy that we could
Just jump in. I think I guess what I would one point that I would definitely want to make, and it's something we've said to each other, is I think it's just, it's not about getting into even the history of philosophy or making it to be what it's become, which is an academic pursuit that's walled off from the rest of humanity. That's ridiculous, and that's not philosophy. Call it whatever you want. That's not what it is. It's Socrates in the marketplace, going around bugging the snot out of people, asking questions, trying to find stuff out, not out of curiosity, but essentially, how to live,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's something that any man can do any day of the week. And it doesn't have to be a philosophy book, but we have to be on the search for meaning, and in our own lives and in the world. And I think the way that you do that is to philosophize.
Yeah,
You have to ask bigger questions,
yeah,
and like you said, you get up every day and say, hey, I haven't lived today before, but you're also saying, how then should I live? The follow-up question to that is, how then should I live today?
definitely.
And, you better have some stuff in that well,
Sure.
or else that bucket's coming up empty, and you're going to fill it with drugs or alcohol or affairs or, whatever.
Whatever. Well, if you're a guy listening to us right now, one of the places you could start if you want to really be serious about taking up the idea about being a philosopher is Viktor Frankl's little book, The Man's Search for Meaning, which is probably the quintessential philosophical book of the 20th and 21st centuries. Frankl was a psychiatrist in Vienna, spent several years in Auschwitz, has watched his whole Jewish family die and how he survived that. And it's his reflections about camp life, similar to Stockdale, and what came out of that experience for him.
Yes.
And that's where the rubber meets the road, really. Very few of us have experiences like that, Jim Stockdale or Viktor Frankl. But what we do with what happens to us is extremely important.
Well, in those stories, and that's so true about Frankl. I'm glad you brought him up because, him, Stockdale, Victor Herman's another one. He was, stuck in Siberia. Solzhenitsyn, even anybody who's been in the gulag for 10 years, the notion of the prison, I don't think we have to go to prison or Siberia or wherever to be confronted with those same questions and to force ourselves to answer them and to dig deeper and that sort of thing. I mean, I think it's every day. The intensity of it, the concentrated tension may not be there like it would be in a prison and total isolation in that, but the questions are there. And, I think that's something that you just do every day.
Before we kind of draw our little conversation to a close, I do want to say to the folks that are listening, Tim and I got two more conversations planned. We're going to do one on why every guy should read poetry.
Yeah.
And we're going to do World War I poetry but both he and I are really enamored at and really I don't want to say enjoy reading, but this is a punch in the gut.
Yeah.
Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen and those guys. This is true test of manliness.
Yeah.
And in the mud fields of Flanders and France and Holland. And Gallipoli in the First World War. And then we're also going to do one on what does a guy do when his father dies? Because both of us have had that experience. And what do you do with that? And so that's coming up, and I don't know, we'll get that figured out. But those are two conversations that we want to have. So Tim, kind of our wrap up here. You and I are in that elevator. And the door closes and we look at each other and, oh, crap. Oh, wow. Yeah. I'm looking at my phone the whole time. What's your elevator speech? What's one little nugget of wisdom that you want us to not only just to think about, but to chew on, maybe, metabolize with? What's the thought about being a philosophical kind of guy? What do you want to leave us with that as a thought?
Well, I think that each day we should question, ourselves, who we are and what we're going to do, what we're going to be. I don't think running on autopilot, stay off of autopilot. I guess that would be my elevator speech. It's too easy now with technology and the ease that we have in this country that we live in to be on autopilot. And so I think that my elevator speech would be, as we're pushing the elevator button, stay off autopilot, force yourself, whether physically, mentally, intellectually, spiritually, whatever, to do more, be more, push yourself beyond boundaries that you've put in place for yourself, and not go on autopilot, because the years just go ticking by, and living a full life with a full heart is beyond what the world can give you, and you can only do that by staying off autopilot.
Yeah. Well, Tim, thanks for joining us in our podcast on Guy Shrink today, and I'll be here to you, and enjoy yourself. Happy weekend, and all our listeners out there, thanks for listening, tuning back in. We got some good things lined up, and look forward to being with you. And wherever you get your podcasts, we're on all of them, along with Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook, and YouTube and Facebook, right? So great. So thanks for listening, and I think Bobby Kennedy used to end his speeches all the time with courage. That's what I like to end our podcast with.
That's right.